Imagine you are digging through a dusty attic in Massachusetts and you find a yellowed piece of parchment tracing your lineage all the way back to the Mayflower. You have spent your whole life believing you are a direct descendant of the original Pilgrims, a walking piece of American history. You pride yourself on that flinty, New England resolve that supposedly flows through your veins. But then, you spit into a plastic tube, send it off to a lab, and get the results back. The report doesn't just suggest a few surprises, it reveals a massive, undeniable gap. When geneticists recently conducted a massive sweep comparing the DNA of documented Pilgrim bloodlines to thousands of modern families across New England who claim that heritage, the results were nothing short of a scientific bombshell. The gap between what the history books tell us and what the double helix reveals is stunning. It turns out that the genetic legacy of the Pilgrims is not a straight line, but a vanishing act. Today we are peeling back 400 years of family secrets to find out why the Pilgrim DNA has all but disappeared from the very places they first called home. To understand how this gap happened, we have to go back to the year 1620. We like to think of the Pilgrims as a large, robust group, but they were actually a tiny genetic bottleneck. There were only 102 passengers on the Mayflower, and many did not survive that first brutal winter. The survivors formed an incredibly small mating pool. In the world of population genetics, this is a founder event. When a tiny group starts a new population, their specific genetic quirks get magnified. If one of the original Pilgrims had a specific rare eye color or a genetic predisposition for a certain trait, that trait would show up everywhere in the early colonies. For a century, the New England gene pool was effectively a closed loop. If you lived in a village in Plymouth or Cape Cod in 1700, almost everyone you knew was a cousin of some degree. But science has a funny way of challenging our myths. A team of researchers decided to use highly advanced long-range phasing and identity by descent mapping to track these specific Pilgrim markers through time. They expected to find a strong, concentrated genetic signal in modern-day New England, especially in the historic old blood families. Instead, they found that the signal had been diluted to the point of being nearly invisible. In many cases, families with ironclad genealogical paperwork, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and family Bibles proving their descent showed zero detectable DNA from the original Pilgrim group. How is that possible? How can you be a descendant of a person but share none of their DNA? This is the great irony of genetics. We have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. By the time you go back 10 or 12 generations to the 1600s, you have thousands of ancestors, but you only have a limited amount of DNA to inherit. Your DNA is like a deck of cards that gets shuffled every generation. Some cards get passed down, and some get dropped. By the 10th generation, there is a very high statistical probability that you have inherited exactly 0 physical DNA segments from any one specific ancestor. You are their descendant on paper, but you are a genetic stranger to them. The study found that for the vast majority of modern New Englanders, the Pilgrim part of their ancestry has been completely eclipsed by more recent waves of migration. The gap isn't just a matter of dilution, though. It's a matter of movement. The study revealed a phenomenon called genetic centrifuge. In the mid-1800s, as the Industrial Revolution took hold, the original Pilgrim families didn't just stay put in Plymouth. They were the ones with the most capital and social mobility. They moved to the Midwest, they headed to the West Coast, and they spread out across the entire continent. Meanwhile, the coastal towns of New England were flooded with new genetic material from Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Quebec. This created a geographic swap. The people living in the historic Pilgrim houses today are genetically far more likely to be from the 19th century immigrant waves, while the actual Pilgrim DNA is scattered thinly across the suburbs of Ohio, California, and Oregon. The scientists focused heavily on the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, which do not get shuffled. These are the unbroken lines. Even here, the results were shocking. They found that a significant number of unbroken paternal lines had been interrupted by what scientists politely call non-paternity events. Across 4 centuries, there are many instances where the legal father and the biological father were not the same person. In a small religious community, these events were often closely guarded secrets. Over 400 years, these secrets add up. The researchers found that in some prestigious lineage societies, Up to 15% of the members were not actually biological matches to the Pilgrim ancestor they claimed. This silent genetic turnover has created a massive disconnect between the names on the Mayflower passenger list and the people walking around with those names today. There is also the factor of selective survival. Not all Pilgrim families were created equal in the eyes of biology. Some families had 10 children who all lived to adulthood and had 10 children of their own. Others had only 1 or 2 descendants before the line faded out. The study noted that a handful of specific Mayflower passengers, like John Alden, William Brewster, and Mary Chilton, are responsible for almost all the surviving Pilgrim DNA in existence. If you don't descend from one of these prolific few, your chances of carrying any Pilgrim DNA are almost zero. The gap is partly because we are looking for a dozen different families, when in reality, the genetic legacy has been narrowed down to just a tiny handful of superproducers. Let's talk about the modern New England profile that the researchers discovered. When they sampled families across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, they found an incredibly vibrant, hyper-mixed genetic signature. The modern New Englander is a fascinating blend of Western and Southern European, with significant inputs from Eastern Canada. This new Yankee DNA is arguably much more robust and diverse than the original Pilgrim pool, but it is a complete departure from the 1620 blueprint. The researchers described it as a genetic replacement that happened so slowly and Victorian-era families didn't even notice it. One of the most entertaining parts of the study involved community testing in historic townships. They went to towns where the street names are all Bradford and Winslow and Carver. They tested the residents who had lived there for generations. The expectation was that these towns would be genetic islands of Pilgrim ancestry, but the data showed that even in these insulated pockets, the genetic influx of the last 200 years has been massive. The stunning gap was evident even in the most traditional families. A person might live in a house built by their 6-times great-grandfather, but their DNA profile looks more like a map of modern-day Dublin or Naples. This raises a deep question about identity. If the DNA isn't there, are you still a Pilgrim descendant? To the scientists, the answer is a matter of biology versus biography. You are a descendant of the culture and the story, but you are no longer a carrier of the biological essence. The study suggests that we should view the Pilgrims not as a foundation that remains beneath the building, but as a spark that started a fire. The fire is still burning, but the original wood is long gone. The researchers also looked at the concept of genetic ghosting. This is when a population's DNA is no longer present in living people, but we can still see its influence in odd genetic markers that pop up in the general population. They found that some unique Pilgrim mutations, specific health markers, or physical traits are now more common in people who don't even know they have Pilgrim ancestry than in the official lineage societies. This is because of casual mixing that happened over centuries. A Pilgrim might have had a child with a newcomer, and that child's descendants eventually forgot the Pilgrim connection. 4 centuries later, that forgotten line might be the only one still carrying the original DNA. This study has been a bit of a wake-up call for the genealogy industry. For years, we have been told that a match is the only thing that matters. But the Pilgrim study shows that no match doesn't mean no connection. It just means that time and the recombination of DNA are much more powerful than we realized. It also highlights the survivor bias in our history. We focus on the Mayflower because it's the famous boat. There were hundreds of other boats and thousands of other settlers who were much more successful at passing down their DNA. In the grand genetic lottery of New England, the Pilgrims were actually the underdogs. The stunning gap also tells us something about the American project as a whole. America is a place of constant reinvention. Even our oldest families have been biologically reinvented several times over. The idea of a pure Yankee lineage is a myth. From the very beginning, there was mixing with local populations, with neighboring colonies, and later with global immigrants. The DNA evidence shows that New England has always been a melting pot, even when the people in charge tried to keep it as a private club. For those of you listening who have done a DNA test, you might have seen New England settlers as a genetic community. What that usually means is that you share DNA with other people who had ancestors in that area between 1700 and 1850. It rarely means you have a direct link to the 1620 group. You are matching the secondary and tertiary waves, the people who actually built the towns and the industries we see today. The 1620 group is a genetic shadow that disappears the closer you look at it. Another fascinating finding was the northward shift. Many of the original genetic markers associated with the Pilgrim families are now found in higher concentrations in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick than in Massachusetts. This is due to the Loyalist migrations after the Revolutionary War. Many of the most traditional Pilgrim descendants, the ones who remained loyal to the British Crown, fled to Canada. So, if you are looking for the truest genetic descendants of the Mayflower, you might actually find them in a small fishing village in Canada, rather than in the suburbs of Boston. The scientists also used an interesting technique called ancient DNA reconstruction. By using samples from known Pilgrim burial sites, they were able to build a composite genome of what a Mayflower passenger would have looked like genetically. When they compared this ghost genome to modern New Englanders have a pan-European signature that is infinitely more complex. The Englishness of the region has been layered over so many times that the original Norfolk signal is drowned out. For anyone who prides themselves on their old-school New England heritage, this might feel like a loss. But the researchers argue it's actually a sign of success. A population that stays genetically pure for 400 years is usually a population that is declining or stagnant. The fact that the Pilgrim DNA has been diluted and dispersed means that those families are part of the broader American story. They didn't just survive, they merged. They became the background noise of the continent. They are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The gap also reveals the limits of paper genealogy. We can track a name through a ledger for hundreds of years, but a name is not a chromosome. A name can be adopted, a name can be changed, and a name can be passed down without a drop of blood. The stunning gap is the difference between our social identity and our biological identity. We are the stories we tell ourselves, but our DNA tells the story of what actually happened in the dark, in the kitchen, and on the long roads of history. What does this mean for the future of DNA testing? It means that ancestry is becoming a two-tiered system. There is the deep ancestry that looks at your ancient origins 10,000 years ago, and there is the recent ancestry that looks at the last 200 years. The golden age of the Pilgrims falls right into the no man's land in between. It is too recent for deep mapping and too old for recent mapping. It is a lost era of genetics. The scientists conclude that the New England families of today are a new biological entity. They are a composite people. They have the work ethic of the Pilgrims, the resilience of the Irish, the passion of the Italians, and the endurance of the French Canadians. This new Yankee DNA is a high-performance blend that is far better suited for the modern world than the fragile, inbred pool of 1620 would have been. The gap is a measure of progress. It is a measure of how far we have come from that lonely beach in Plymouth. If you are a member of a Mayflower Society, keep your paperwork. It's a vital part of American history. But don't expect your DNA to back you up in a court of law. You are a descendant of a legend. You are the guardian of a set of values and a historical narrative. Your DNA might be 99% modern immigrant, but your life is shaped by the decisions made by those 102 people in 1620. That is the true inheritance. The scientific community is now looking at other founder populations to see if the same gap exists. They are looking at the Quakers in Pennsylvania, the Cavaliers in Virginia, and the Huguenots in South Carolina. Early results suggest that the Pilgrim gap is the rule, not the exception. The founding DNA of America is disappearing across the board. We are becoming a new people at a rate that is breathtaking from a biological perspective. In the end, the study of Pilgrim DNA tells us that humans are not like trees. We don't just stay in one place and grow roots. We are more like the ocean that brought the Mayflower here, constantly moving, constantly mixing, and never the same from one minute to the next. The stunning gap is just the space where history happened. It's the space where millions of people lived, loved, and changed the world. And that is a much more interesting story than a simple match. So the next time you see a statue of a pilgrim, remember that their greatest legacy isn't a specific set of genes. It's the fact that they started something so big that it eventually swallowed their own DNA. They gave up their genetic identity so that a new American identity could be born. And that might be the most pilgrim thing they ever did. They stepped into the unknown, and they never came back. Not even in their own descendants' blood. We are all genetic ghosts in one way or another, carrying bits and pieces of people we will never know, and losing pieces of ourselves with every generation. The gap isn't a void. It's a bridge. It's the bridge between 1620 and today. And though the bridge has been rebuilt many times, the path remains the same. The Pilgrim DNA might be gone, but the journey continues. Keep digging into your history. Keep asking the hard questions of your DNA, and remember that you are more than just a sequence of letters. You are a chapter in a story that is still being written 400 years later. As we look at the results of this study, We shouldn't be dismayed. We should be fascinated. We live in the only time in human history where we can actually see the disappearance of our ancestors' code. We are witness to the beautiful, chaotic, and messy process of evolution in real time. The Pilgrim Gap is a masterpiece of natural history, and we are the canvas. Stay curious, stay proud of your story, and never forget that who you are is much more than what a lab can find in a drop of saliva. The history of the world is written in our blood, even when the ink starts to fade. And in New England, the fading ink has made room for a whole new book.